welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and our special guests for today's episodes are Tanya Spitzer, project manager here at the museum.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, Tommy Lofton, director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum.
Hey, guys.
Today, we will be discussing the 1962 film Hell is for Heroes. Hell is for Heroes focuses on a small, depleted squad of soldiers in the 95th Infantry Division situated on the Siegfried Line near the Moselle River in late 1944. The squad is ordered to hold a section of the front line meant for a much larger unit and are thinly spread in front of ominous German concrete bunkers. Fully aware of their precarious position, the squad goes on to great lengths to fool the Germans as to their actual numbers and deter any enemy attacks. Hell is for Heroes stars Steve McQueen as Private Reese, Bobby Darin as Private Corby, James Coburn as Henshaw, Bob Newhart, Fess Parker, and many others. The film was directed by Don Siegel, produced by Henry Blank, and written by Richard Carr and Robert Peroche. The production was hampered throughout by infighting amongst the cast and director, as well as a low budget. Despite this, the film was, and still is, critically well thought of. So, Tanya, I'll start with you because you're sitting right next to me. In your opinion, despite your jet lag, Tanya, in your opinion, how accurate is this film?
Well, first of all, yes, I'm sorry. I'm really jet-lagged. I just came back from visiting my family in Germany. So, yeah, don't take anything too serious of what I'm going to say. But from what I can tell, I think the movie is fairly accurate in its description of or depiction of those, I think, about 2 days probably that we see in the movie. Not being a military historian per se, what stuck out to me that I think is very accurate is kind of the individual interactions of the soldiers, the kind of tension that shows in their interaction with each other, and that is something that stuck out to me as where I could relate to, and I felt like that was very, very realistic depiction of personal human interaction in tough times.
We'll get to that in a little more depth here in a couple of minutes, talking about the interaction between squad members. Tommy, what about you?
I think it was very accurate, and I think it's actually kind of an underrated film in a lot of ways too. Enjoy the uniforms are accurate, the weaponry in there is good. The overall concept and thought that these guys are going home and going to be home by Christmas, and then all of a sudden, nope, you're going to the front line. I think that's a common thread in a lot of wars, but especially World War II. So overall, yeah, I think it's actually a pretty accurate film.
Yeah, I agree. I think the film is pretty accurate in a lot of ways. And I agree with what you said too, Tommy. It is kind of a forgotten film. It's not one that like pops to the top of the list when you're talking about World War II movies for many reasons, not the least of which is it's never on TV. I don't ever remember seeing it on TV, frankly. But it is accurate, and that it focuses on a portion of the war that I can't really think of any other movies except for maybe the TV show Combat, which I know we'll talk about in a little while because of Robert Peroche, but that really focuses on the Siegfried Line and actions around there. There's only like maybe one other one that I can think of, and that's kind of throwing it out there, and that would be When Trumpets Fade. But overall, I think the movie is pretty accurate, and it focuses on a real unit too. The 95th Infantry Division, you'll see the patches on some of the characters' sleeves on their M41 jackets. They wear the patch of the 95th. And what's really cool is that the 95th was obviously a real unit, but it was a real unit that was in this location near the Moselle River at the Siegfried Line at this time of the war. And I mean that's pretty damn accurate there, and that's something that a lot of movies don't necessarily do with a great deal of detail, and this one does. Let's talk about that for a minute. And Tommy, I'm going to start with you because it does focus on the 95th near the Siegfried Line. How accurate is the portrayal of that unit, and specifically the U.S. incursions into the Siegfried in 1944?
Well, I'd say it's pretty accurate, especially at the time frame that they're there. There's somewhat of a stalemate in most areas of the Siegfried Line. There's movement trying to get across into Germany, and then, of course, as you know, as 1944 moves on, we get into the Battle of the Bulge, and we're still fighting around a lot of the Siegfried Line and Hurtgen Forest region and everything else. But no, I think I think they picked a great unit. This is a unit that doesn't get a lot of recognition in a lot of places, and I think even the language, the locations they're referring to, the battles or skirmishes and things within the film all play pretty well into the history of this unit, of this location, of this part of the war.
What about you, Tanya? What do you think?
Well, I really don't have much to add to that. I mean, yeah, it's not a well-known unit as far as I can tell. And, you know, doing my research for this, I could see that the locations, the places, it all kind of added up. And it is mentioned that it is based on real events. I think the trailer I watched back from '62 said, you know, based on real events and real heroes. And I do think that was not you know, they were not over mentioning that.
Yeah.
Is that English? I'm sorry. Here comes the jet lag.
No, I think that's good. I mean, you're right there. I mean, the Siegfried Line is something that was an imposing defensive line for the Germans in 1944. I mean, they call it the West Wall. You know, that was their western wall of defenses. And most of these bunkers, not all of them, but most of these bunkers were built before the war, actually. You know, kind of the Germans' Maginot Line, if you will. Not really, but sort of.
Well, I was going to say, I like the idea, too, in the film. You know, you see, as they get on the line, they're in a knocked-out bunker. They've got foxholes that were already prepared, and they're looking across at another hill, at a whole other bunker. It shows you how well defended the Germans had this area. And, you know, as soon as you knock out one pillbox or one area, you think you're done, and you get over the hilltop, and it's like, oh, man, now we got a whole nother one to go after. So.
And the way they laid it out, too, and you see it in a lot of the scenes in the movie, the combat scenes in the movie, is that it was a defense in depth.
Yeah.
You know, it was one bunker, like you said, and that bunker was in front of another bunker, but in between those two bunkers were minefields and barbed wire and interlocking machine gun nests and pre-registered artillery positions and all this kind of stuff, so that when the Germans knew that we were coming, or the Brits, or depending on where they were on the line, they were going to be able to throw down that fire, you know, at a moment's notice, which is what you see in the film, you know, in different spots. And that the Germans haven't been there for as long as they had. I mean, they weren't there for 4 years waiting on us, but I mean, the units that were moving back through there knew that territory pretty well. And again, that is shown in this movie, and that, you know, they have incursions into the American lines, into the American bunkers, where, you know, McQueen and the rest of those guys are hunkered down because they know how to get there, and they they appear out of nowhere seemingly, and it's, you know, it's pretty dang accurate, because they could do that because this was their territory, you know, maybe the night before or the week before or later that afternoon or whatever it may have been.
I would say, yeah, it's you know, it's not a surprise battle. You think of a lot of battles in World War II, whether it's Catherine Pass or Battle of the Bulge, or you know, even on our part with the invasion of Normandy, that was a surprise, obviously, for the Germans. But this is a battle that there was some time, there was some preparation. There were, like you said, defenses, minefields, barbed wire, other things laid out there with some preparation. So this was going to be a slaughterhouse at some point, one way or the other, for one side or the other.
And go ahead, Tanya.
No, and I think the point that you made is that you, Seth, made is very interesting. It's this kind of like, yes, they knew the territory and the Americans did not. And you can kind of see that in the movie, the way I, you know, kind of saw the actors showing this kind of, hey, we're at a point here where we need to somehow do something. We can't just sit here and wait, because they know, right? We cannot just, we can't keep this trickery up for too long. And I think a huge part is that, you know, they know the territory and we don't.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, to both of your points, I mean, the fact that, you know, like you said, Tommy, it's not a surprise attack. We knew that the Germans were over there. Germans knew that we were over, you know, in their former bunker or trench line or whatever it may be. You know, led to a lot of tension, because in some places, in some events, like, you know, the Battle of the Bulge, for instance, you didn't know if the Germans were in that forest, or, you know, the Germans didn't know how many Americans were in Krinkelt, or, you know, places like that. They didn't know. You knew how many guys were across that line because you could see them.
This is probably, too, one of the areas where I would say in the war, and people may argue with this later online, but it's closer to the war that came before it. I think 1917, 1918 time frame.
Absolutely.
You know, this is closer to that type of warfare than what we had even been fighting in a lot of places up to this point.
Absolutely, which is kind of ironic, because you know, as I said, the defenses, same thing with the Maginot Line in France, they were built to avoid that type of warfare, yet the trench warfare, of course, the stagnation of the front. And yet that's exactly what they caused, in reality.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I have to say I hadn't thought of that. But this kind of getting the two wars and the kind of structures that were left over, and that leads to a similar form of warfare that is very.
It's easy to forget World War I, and if you want a good lesson on it, we have an exhibit at the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum that actually gets into World War I and trench warfare.
So the ETO, or the European Theater of Operations, was infamous for its later war replacement soldier regulations. And this is something we see in the movie with Steve McQueen. What were those issues, and how did they affect U.S. morale and fighting integrity? I'm going to go ahead and take this one.
Go ahead,
because this was my talking point. But you see McQueen come in the movie. He's a veteran. He's kind of he's got a beard, which is not accurate at all. But whatever, it's Steve.
He doesn't care anymore.
No, he's beyond the point of caring is a polite way to put it. But he walks in. He's an obvious veteran. He's been transferred from another unit. You find out later he's been transferred. He's been basically removed from that unit and put somewhere else because his CO was sick and tired of dealing with him because he's a drunk. And he's a drunk because you find out again later in the movie, the guy's got issues. He's got some serious issues. He's seen a lot of combat. He's got PTS is what it is. But he's thrown into this unit, this established unit with these other guys, and he's an immediate outsider. And being the veteran that he is, he knows not to get close to any of these people because more than likely they're going to be killed. And they, being the veterans that they are, the other guys in the squad also know, don't get close to this guy because he's more than likely going to get killed. And this is something that was a major problem in the European theater. The U.S. Army had this replacement system in 1944 and 45 that when guys got hit or they were sick or whatever, coming back from leave even, coming back from Paris or London or even the States, they weren't put in, more often than not, they were not put back into their original units, which was a horribly stupid idea because units build cohesion, they're a team. I mean, I'm not trying to sound like, a football coach, but they're a team. And they all depended on one another. And all of a sudden you get a new guy, be he a veteran, like McQueen is in the movie, or some, green as grass guy like Bob Newhart is in the movie, and blam, you throw him into this unit that is tight, theoretically, that have people that have known each other. They've either served with each other from the time that they trained or a year or two or whatever it may be, and this guy's an immediate outsider. And it's not necessarily that you want to make friends, but can you count on that guy? Can he count on you? And I don't know if it necessarily hurt American fighting integrity. I don't really think it did because obviously we won the war, but I don't think it added to anything either. I could say it with pretty good certainty it probably messed with morale at times, and I think that's why having done so many oral histories in this area and talk to guys who, as soon as they learn, look, if I get hit, if I'm in that hospital too long, my unit moves on, and like you said, I get to get reassigned to another unit. You see a lot of folks who say, forget this. I've been here a few days. I'm going back to the front line. I don't want my unit to go on without me. I don't want to let my buddies down, whatever. And you see them just leaving the hospital, even if they're not really ready to, and working their way back up to the front to be with their unit rather than some other new unit.
Yeah, and it makes absolute sense. I mean, if we just, look at everyday examples now, I mean, if you lose a colleague, if you, a friend moves away, as small as that is in comparison to what these guys are going through, everything is restructured. And so every time somebody leaves a unit like this or somebody new comes in, new personal issues can bubble up. And I have to say in the movie, I have to disagree a little bit, because I do think that at the beginning we see the other guys trying to at least be friendly to the Steve McQueen character, to Reese, but you see Reese like actively just like not shaking the hand of a guy who's offering his hand.
You get a point. Yep.
So it is, that whole issue is heightened by his loner character, by his I do not give
a rat's patoot.
Thanks for helping me out there.
Not a problem. But no, you're right. You're 100% right. There are instances in the beginning of the movie where the guys in the squad do try and at least say, hey, how you doing, and that kind of thing. And he completely shuns them. And my whole point in this, in saying this, is that, and I was going to get to that, Tommy, is that, it was it was an epidemic, with veterans leaving the hospital, going AWOL, going AWOL to leave the hospital without orders to get back with their unit, because if they were going to go fighting, which, clearly they were, if they were going to get back into the fight, they wanted to be with the people that they knew. They wanted to be with the people that they could trust. And I mean, it's a cliched statement, but it's cliched because it's true, and you're fighting with your brothers, and you want to be with the people that you love and care about, and that's what they all did. And for the Army to institute this replacement system where they just took guys and threw them in the middle of nowhere with a unit and a bunch of people that they did not know was arguably one of the worst decisions that could have been made for morale in the United States Army and the European theater in World War II. It was a mess. And anybody who was a veteran or someone who was thrown into those units almost unanimously agree that was just a bad thing to do. But
the downside is there's not a whole lot else you could do at the time.
Well, that's arguable too, because I mean, they could have, in the Pacific, they had replacement units. They sent, the Marine Corps had replacement details of people that were, these guys need 10 guys. Well, here's 8, and I mean, it was done like that. It wasn't, here's one guy. Not very often. I mean, it was, but very, very, not very often was that done in the Pacific Theater. For whatever reason, it was done more in the ETO. But not every soldier carried a gun, fired said gun, or served on the front lines in the war, as most of the general public might believe, and that is very true. Divisions, infantry divisions are anywhere between 12 to 15,000 men, depending on the time of war, and I'd say about 4,000 or 5,000 of those guys actually pulled a trigger. But so let's discuss this and tie it to Bob Newhart's role in the film. Tommy, go ahead and roll with that one for me.
Yeah, so, it's interesting. It depends on whose book you read. For every one person pulling a trigger on the front lines in World War II, there was 10 to maybe 15 people helping to supply that person or make sure that they have what they need on the front lines. I think Bob Newhart's character in this film shows you, there's people in the Army who maybe haven't ever fired a weapon, or if they did, it was when they first got in. He's... spoiler alert if you hadn't seen the film, he's a typist. And clearly that's his world. He doesn't know much else about this, and clearly doesn't know how to read a map and get the Jeep to the right location either.
That's obvious.
But yet has to, soldier first. So he has to fall in on the front lines and learn how to use his rifle pretty quickly. But I think it's a good example to show you there were a lot of different roles within the military, and more specifically for this film, within the Army, to make this war work and to make us receive or achieve victory in the end.
Absolutely, and I kind of see that every day here with our World War II research services, where we work with the stories of people's grandfathers, fathers, and most of those stories, at least so far, have been, those folks didn't really see action, quote unquote. They were, in the back, and they were in the supply chain somewhere. And it's tricky sometimes to make their folks understand that what they did was still really amazing. Just because they didn't fire a gun doesn't mean that they weren't integral to the war effort. But it is a very common, I don't want to call it a misconception, but an assumption that, if grandfather was in the war, then he was on the front lines.
No, that's 100%, 150% accurate. That's very well said. And then, just look at it like this. Think about this. So at the Battle of Midway, there were 2 SPD squadrons that flew, Dauntless Dive Bomber squadrons that flew from the carrier Enterprise. There were 32 SPDs, and there were 2 guys in each SPD, so that's 64 guys. 64 guys from the Enterprise in those 2 SPD squadrons saw combat at Midway, some of them several times during that 4-day event. Yet the Enterprise had over 2,000 sailors on it that never saw, at least at Midway, never heard a shot fired in anger. Yet they were at the event. They were in the Battle of Midway.
Right.
So just take that. Obviously Enterprise might not be the best example because she saw more combat than any vessel in the Navy history.
For Europe, you got guys who never leave Paris or never leave.
Right. Or, look at the Army Air Forces. You got guys who served in the 91st Bomb Group from 1942 to 45 who never got off the ground, literally.
Yeah.
They were a supply sergeant in England the entire war.
Yeah, and one role that I had to keep thinking back to is translators that would come in, and they had such an integral role and was so. I mean, if you captured a German and you need to figure out what he's saying, you better have a translator at hand, right? So these are the kinds of roles that are really important, and then of course the Bob Newhart role. I mean, in the movie, he's not only the typist and he's important in bringing the Jeep and then being trained, but he is also the comedic relief in many ways. That is a bit odd at times, if I may say so. I was a bit surprised at that little telephone routine, I have to say.
Apparently, I did not know this until preparing for this movie, but that was something he was known for at that time. That was part of his shtick.
Before this point, he was a big stand-up comedian, and he would always do these one-sided phone calls, I think, on stage, and that was why they put this in the film. In fact, I think Perosh and several others wanted to take it out and didn't want it to happen, but they knew this is Bob Newhart at the time. He's a recognizable individual. And actually, it's my understanding he ad-libbed some of that or wrote the script as to what he was saying.
That's what I read,
That was about the only thing that wasn't, I think, military run.
And I think he himself was not super happy with the role or with what he was supposed to do either, and apparently kept begging the directors, like, just kill me off. Here are some ideas of, like, how you could, kill my character. But they're like, nope, you're in until the end.
Yeah.
Whether you like it or not, kind of like the Army.
Exactly.
So, how do you feel? How do you feel about the way the allegiances and cultural ties are shown in this film, Tanya? What do you think?
Well, one thing that stuck out to me was the role of language. It's not very front and center, but I noticed it twice. Once with that Polish kid, Homer, I think is his name, when he comes in, and his role in the movie, and he tries very hard to show his allegiance to the Americans, for obvious reasons. And at some point, they are in. I think he's trying to interrogate the Germans and the Polish. What was his name?
Kalinsky.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
He tries to calm him down and speaks Polish to him, and he completely shuts him down. He's like, "Don't speak that language to me. We're speaking English here." And to me, that stuck out because my assumption is if you're out on the battlefield and you have someone speaking in your native language, that must feel comforting and helpful. Yet here's this guy who tries very, very hard to be one of the Americans. He wants to be taken to the U.S. with them. He wants to show that he can do this. And so that stuck out to me. Another scene it's, one of the smaller scenes, but I keep coming back to it in my, replaying the movie in my head. And that's fairly early in the movie when he goes to the bar, when Steve McQueen guy goes to the bar and has that interaction with that French woman. And they speak English. And at the very end, it's this whole question of who do you drink with, which is another whole thought. But yeah, she's making these, it's like, hey, we can go over in my room and we can drink where the MPs won't find you. And he starts talking in German. He says, wie viel? How much? And she responds in German. And that in that moment changes everything, right? All of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, so you know how to have this conversation in German as well. So that shows me something.
Yeah, that scene stuck out to me too, because first of all, it's right at the beginning of the movie, or fairly, not long into the film itself. And, that's an interesting topic of conversation, and that, and not to bag on our allies, but I mean, every Frenchman in today's view of history was in the resistance, and that's just not the case. That's just not the case at all. There were plenty of collaborators, whether you were trying to get by doing whatever you had to do to get food, or to avoid being shot, or whatever it may be. Not everybody was in the resistance, and I think this movie, showing that in 1962 is kind of unique, because the French were our buddies, and they still are, obviously. But I mean, it was kind of unique to show that in 1962, I think.
Yeah, and it's a fairly short scene, but it's very intense.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
I like talking about culturally too. I think it's interesting to see the different cultures within the unit and when you have Steve McQueen show up, which, by the way, I don't know how many of you noticed this, when he's walking with his barracks bag down the hallway looking to see what room he's supposed to be in, Hell is for Heroes is written on the wall of the hallway. And
I did not see that. I saw the Hitler in the toilet. Toilet scene.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of graffiti, obviously, but if you look very carefully, right before he walks into that room, if I remember correctly, and he's kind of going down the hall, it says Hell is for Heroes right behind him, kind of written over his right shoulder, if I remember correctly. But, you see him into that room, and you've got guys who are sitting there just sleeping, killing time. You've got another guy who's scrounging and literally trying to capture, I think, every piece of silver he can find in Europe and send it home or whatever as war trophies, war booty, if you will. And then even when they get to the pillbox, he's trying to figure out if he can store more stuff in there. You see different personalities within the unit, and I like that they're not trying to show everybody as a 100% battle-charging, apple pie-eating hero, and they're actually showing there are some character flaws in some of these individuals, and even if you take Bob Newhart, who's not a tough guy, he still proves to be useful to the unit, and he still plays an important role within what they have to endure.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to the question of how realistic is this? Because it would not be realistic if all you'd see were those, to quote you, battle-charging, apple pie eating.
Right.
Because that's not what the United States Army was or is.
No.
But no,
except in movies.
Well, like this, no, not at all. But no, I like the fact that they showed that guy. He's a looter, is what he is. He's not. I wouldn't call him a scrounger.
Well, yeah,
he wasn't looking for scraps of meat to feed the guys a steak. He was looking for stuff to send home, and I like that they showed that, because that's a fact of war, of any war, but especially in the European theater. As they say, if it wasn't nailed down, and even if it was, it came home with a soldier from the United States Army.
Why do we think there's so many Nazi flags and Adolf Hitler tea sets and everything
Exactly.
in various museums around the country?
Exactly.
That's how we got a ton of what we have on displays.
Yeah, no doubt. That's where it came from, and it didn't just magically appear here. And I like the fact that they showed that, because that is a very, and this movie too, like a lot of movies that we've talked about on this podcast, I don't know, because it's 1962, it's debatable whether or not this was a movie meant for World War II veterans. Like Battleground was meant for World War II veterans. That's undeniable. But
which is tied to this film too.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a minute. But I can't say for sure if this was meant for World War II veterans or if it was meant for kids as an exciting movie. I don't know. But I guarantee you a World War II veteran who served in the ETO saw that and went, oh, yeah, I knew that guy. Or I was that guy. Yeah. We ate on the silver I stole tonight, as a matter of fact. But it goes all back to the accuracy, and it goes back to the writer of the film, who was Robert Peroche. And he wrote also, wait for it, Battleground, one of the finest movies ever made, and
Go for Broke.
Go for Broke, and
Combat,
and another one. I forget what the hell it was right now. I just drew a blank.
Yeah.
But
pull up the wiki.
Yeah, right. But Robert Peroche, let's talk about his World War II service and how it informed his contributions to not just this film, but all of his films. Tommy.
Well, I know we talked about him a little bit during Battleground, when we talked about his service, if I remember correctly, 35th Division, served in Europe. And it's interesting to me, the similarities in this movie with other movies of his in dialogue or in style, even as far as realism goes. It's you can definitely tell that his hands were involved in this, and that there were people involved with making this film who were in military service in World War II or Korea, potentially. And I don't know, I just think it's, to me, when I first started watching this movie, I haven't seen it in years. It used to come on occasionally on Turner Classic Movies or American Movie Classics during like Veterans Day and stuff, but other films maybe have replaced that over time. But I do remember, I guess probably last time I saw it, I was a teenager or something. Grew up loving the show Combat, which I know still comes on occasional TV shows, and it was TV channels. It was interesting to watch even the filming of this and how they go back and forth from Steve McQueen to Davy Crockett, Fess Parker, and how they're framing things, even the title sequence. If you go and watch the beginning of Combat, the intro, if you will, to the TV show, and you go back and watch the intro to this, there's just dead-on similarities that you can see where the seeds are being planted for that television show. How it's laid out, how the drama's laid out, even the action. There's slow periods where guys are talking, ribbing each other, arguing with each other, and then boom, all of a sudden shells start coming in and the Germans show up and start firing at them.
Which is accurate.
Yeah, yeah. And so there's accuracy in that, but it's interesting to me too, like I said earlier, you know, it's interesting to me that this film is not more popular than it is, because it is so closely tied to other projects that are well loved.
Well, one of the criticisms that I've been seeing pop up everywhere is that it looks too much like a TV show. And I wonder if that has to do with the fact that way more people know combat. And it is shot, you know, it doesn't look like it's very, you know, like there's a lot of money that went into it.
Low budget.
Yeah, definitely low budget.
And a lot of the scenes are at night for various reasons. We know it was shot at night because it was too hot during the day, but also I'm assuming it was for stylistic reasons. And so that adds to it's not the easiest to watch, especially if you are into, you know, watching battle scenes that are, you know, well lit, so you can see what's happening. So, you know, this darkness, this kind of, you know, hard to see exactly everything that's happening around it might have added to the fact that it's not as popular as it might be.
Well, and I like that there's night combat in there too, because, you know, so many other movies, World War II or otherwise, make it look like fighting only happens from sun up to sundown. And to me, it actually made some of the flamethrower sequences and stuff in this film look that much cooler, or explosions, when it was dark. So I actually kind of like the night combat sequences.
I do too. But I agree with you, Tanya. This movie I did not watch a lot of combat, the show, when I was a kid, but I've seen it. You know, I've seen enough of it to know. And this movie reminded me of the show. Like, it just did. You know, like you said, Tommy, from the opening, the title sequence to the way it was shot. You know, it was low budget. I mean, that's a fact. It was a low budget film. But if you compare this with combat, you can see just visually they're very, very similar. And then if you compare this movie with Battleground, visually, they're completely different. Completely different. Battleground was a big budget production, so I mean the money is clearly there.
Oh yeah.
You know, they did film some scenes on a soundstage for Battleground, but you know, a lot of this movie was filmed in a soundstage too. And then there's a lot of scenes too. To your point, Tanya, why it was done at night, it's very obvious that it's California when they're shooting these exterior scenes, especially in that final attack when they're going across the minefield to the other bunker. If you've ever been to California, it's pretty easy to see that this is California. Whereas in Battleground, they filmed a lot of it out Seattle, didn't they? Somewhere up north.
I'd have to look it back up. I don't recall.
Either
but I think
way,
it was
if you didn't know any
somewhere.
better, you could think that it was the Ardennes. Whereas this, there's no doubt. I mean, this is not the Moselle River. This is, you know, up near Sacramento somewhere probably. But
I have every episode of Combat on DVD if you want to borrow it.
Oh, sure. I'll take a look at it.
Movie night.
Yeah.
Also, you talked about the final battle sequence. Did you notice the what's his name? The guy who wants to be an American, but he's not.
Homer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you see Homer, like, bust his butt? If you go back and watch the battle sequences and they're starting the charge, he actually falls over a log and just face plants in the dirt and then sort of gets up and dusts off and runs again.
Nice.
It sort of just falls off camera. It's pretty funny. Anyway.
Nice. Well, most World War II films that feature Americans stick with the M1s and the Thompsons and all that sort of thing. What makes this film unique with the weaponry, both U.S. and German? And Tommy, this one's yours, so let it roll.
That they used stuff outside of, you know, they have a grease gun in there. There's not a lot of movies, even after World War II, where you see that. Typically it's an M1 Garand. Well, yeah, you do see it in Dirty Dozen, but, you know, M1 Garands, carbines, things like that. You know, even the Germans have automatic weapons in this, and even if you go back and watch Combat and other shows, they're doing good to have K98s in that film sometimes, or TV show. But I do like that they have that. They have a mixture of, you know, they're using flamethrowers in here. There's not a lot of other movies, too, that had that capability. Satchel charges. You know, they're talking about minefields now. How they go through the minefields a little cheesy, but compared to the way they would have done it with a knife or bayonet trying to crawl through there and locate the mines. But I like that they do things outside of just a normal expected, you know, couple of weapons that people think of from that war.
It's interesting, too. You talk about the M3. Of course, that's the weapon that McQueen has. And he's got, you know, and and this is one of the faults that I could find with the movie is that, you know, he's not wearing, you're talking about equipment, he's not wearing the right equipment for that. He's wearing an M1 at 23 cartridge belt, which is not appropriate for an M3 grease gun. Then he's got, you know, half a dozen magazines taped together with friction tape on there, which would have weighed, you know, I don't know, about 15 pounds on the front end of that weapon. And then, too, if you watch in the final battle sequence when he's making his charge, one of the things that they were plagued with in this movie was the low budget that we just talked about. And one of the issues that they had were the weapons firing properly. And I'm not sure if it was because of poor blanks or poorly blank-adapted weapons. I don't know. But if you watch the final battle sequence with Steve McQueen, because the camera's right on him, he's rolling with that M3, and he has to recharge that weapon about 10 times to get through a 30-round magazine, which, if you've ever shot an M3, and I have, generally, when you rack that weapon and pull the trigger, it just goes. It doesn't stop unless you want it to. So you could tell that, you know, if you watch it and go back and watch that short sequence, he's struggling. McQueen is struggling with that weapon. And he doesn't show it. He does a very good job. But he doesn't, you know, he's having a lot of trouble trying to fire that weapon.
I went and looked it up after I saw that and noticed it, and it said they were plagued with bad or poorly made blanks throughout a lot of the film because of the low budget, and apparently it was aggravating, not only for him, but for a lot of the actors. And I think that's why they also, you know, use Roman candles and things for some of the sequences and firing in there and using that as quote-unquote tracer fire and other stuff. I also read that, and you can kind of see it in the film, in the sequence when they're running back from the bunker, if I remember correctly, one of the actors' coat starts catching on fire from the Roman candle. Jerk him down and put the fire out.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a weapon specialist, surprise. But the one thing that I noticed, and where I had to look it up and was kind of surprised, and I'd be interested, you mentioned it just now, would you say, is when they crawl through the minefield. Why are they using their hands? I mean, this can't be, this seems almost suicidal.
The Hollywood drama. I mean, you know, you didn't want to go through a minefield on your stomach anyway, but in a situation like that, typical training and protocol would show that you would go forward in a single line, typically very well spread out too, and you would be probing the ground with a knife trying to find, so that you're not taking a chance on hitting whatever's on top. The way they were doing it, that was, you're right, it is almost suicidal or a recipe for disaster from the very beginning. So not ideal if you're listening and you're ever crawling through a minefield. Don't do it that way.
You know, one of the best scenes for getting through a minefield, and it is kind of cockeyed in that, you know, they're trying to go through a minefield in the middle of the daylight when there's clearly other routes of advance. Is Kelly's Heroes.
I know exactly.
And there's a scene in Kelly's Heroes where they're going through this minefield, and you watch it and you're like, why the hell are you going through this? There's a road right over here, dude. But it is what it is. But they're going through this minefield, and they're one after the other, and they are very well spaced apart, and they're probing the dirt with bayonets and M3 fighting knives, trying to hear that clink when they hit that metal mine, so they can mark it and get the hell around it. That's actually that's a good thing, even though they could have gone down the road. But anyway, back to this movie. What do you think of the casting choices? So it's got Bob Newhart, Bobby Darin, who was a singer, and then old Uncle Steve there. Tanya, what do you think?
Well, it's certainly interesting, was my first thought when I saw the names show up on the screen. I was like, you know, Bobby Darin. To me, you know, Splish Splash comes to my mind.
Right.
Like, that's not necessarily World War II related. So, you know, we already mentioned Bob Newhart being kind of the comedic relief and or comic relief, and I'm not a huge fan of his role, I have to say. To me, it kind of stuck out as something. It's like, what was this supposed to be funny? Am I supposed to be laughing? And Bobby Darin, I was surprised. I really thought he was. I liked him. I think they made a good choice because he is that kind of battlefield hoarder role of this kind of guy who's just trying to get out of it what he can, and he seems good. And I looked into Bobby Darin's biography a little bit, and it's interesting because he seemed to, you know, he started acting in movies and became more and more serious, and then eventually even wanted to go into politics himself, but some personal histories then kept him from doing that. But there's more to him than just Splish Splash, as I learned. So I was impressed by him, and Steve McQueen, of course. Also, James Coburn was an interesting character. Looks,
he's very young.
He's very young
in this movie.
And I like the way he plays this kind of this mechanic that doesn't want to be anything other than a mechanic, and helps them with their with his ideas of coming up with new tricks. And then Steve McQueen is Steve McQueen.
Yeah.
You can tell he doesn't want to be there, and you wonder, is that acting or does he really not want to be there? But yeah.
From what I read about McQueen is that he did not want to be there at all. And he was irritated with his agent for having signed him up. Basically, he's like, "Here, you're going to do this movie next." He didn't want to do it. And like you said, is the loner attitude, is that him doing his normal method acting, or is that, or is it he just really doesn't want to be there, or a combination of the two? It's probably a combination of the two.
Well, I read too, he tried to keep himself separate from the cast since he knew his role was sort of a loner. He didn't want to be buddies with these guys all the time. So there was some division between he and some of the cast members. Even I think there's even some scuffles with he and Bobby Darin off camera. So, and at first. I didn't know how I would like Bobby Darin being in there. I felt like, they just put this in here so guys could take their wives or whatever to see the movie.
That's kind of what I thought too, honestly.
But by the end, he seemed to have so much more depth, especially after several people around him have died. And, at that point when I think it's Fess Parker's asking them, where's first squad, second squad, something. And it's just three guys, and he's one of them, and he's like, this is it, And he seems to be taking the war much more serious in that point than when he was looting and things earlier. But
that's true. There is actual character development there. I think probably in his character the most, compared to the rest. Really, I'm thinking about it right now, because no one else has that kind of arc between being this kind of almost happy-go-lucky as he appears at the beginning. To the end when he sees Reese die and just loses it in the ground.
Yep. Good points all. Getting back to James Coburn before we move on, he did a movie, a really good Western with Steve McQueen shortly before this movie. Of course, it was The Magnificent Seven, and you got to kind of wonder how much of a hand McQueen had in getting, because they were buddies, they were pals, and of course they also did later The Great Escape. And other movies too, but those two specifically stand out. So you got to wonder how much of a hand McQueen had in getting one of his pals on the film, or maybe even vice versa. Who knows? I don't know. But Coburn's exceedingly young in this movie, and you always think of him as a much older man, because that's generally what you see him as in many of the movies he does later, like The Great Escape. He's not a young man in that movie either.
And they play well on camera. They do really well, especially in that attack sequence with Coburn and when they're crawling at night toward the pillbox and all. That was, they played that really well. You're almost holding your breath during some of that.
Yeah. Well done. Well, the film makes interesting stylistic choices. There's a lot of long scenes, the abrupt ending. What are your thoughts on those choices, and do you think they work, Tanya? What do you think?
Well, especially when it comes to the abrupt ending, I thought, wow, that's a amazing choice to end the movie here. I was not ready for it, and I think a lot of people weren't. Apparently, that's one of the reasons it has such a cult following. But now that I've, after I watched the movie and wrote down my notes and then read up on it, apparently that was not necessarily a stylistic choice, but rather they ran out of money and quite literally ran out of film, and so had to stop there. So I think it worked well for the movie. What else could come after, now that I'm thinking about it? But yeah, it apparently wasn't really a choice so much as a necessity. It's black and white. In 1962 it didn't have to be. I think it adds to the tension, to the whole vibe that they're creating. The one thing that I thought was interesting is, again, we're coming back to that minefield scene that was incredibly long to me, with 2019 eyes, because I just expected a much shorter frame. It didn't need to be as long as it was. I think it was about 4 to 5 minutes long until they finally, touched one of the mines. And that was something that occurred to me. I was like, this is really a very typical 60s choice of having these incredibly long frames to kind of draw to the tension to the point where you're just like, okay, I got it. Like, what comes next, right?
Yeah, they only had so many explosions they could pay for and other things too. So,
gotta make them last.
Yeah, and I think, well, you know, I think it's a good film. I really do. And I think, going back to your black and white, if I remember correctly, and someone I'm sure will let me know if I'm wrong later, you know, combat was the same way. The first few seasons, especially, the core of what everybody loves of that show, a few years after this movie, were black and white. And it seemed to have a huge following with World War II veterans still. And then when they switched to color, much like a lot of shows did in the 60s, it sort of dropped off in its viewership. And I think it almost became too real, in a sense. You know, you watch this stuff in black and white, it's one thing, but especially for a World War II veteran, if you start seeing it in color, it's either too hokey or it's too close to the real thing, and I don't want to watch it anymore. I just think that's may or may not be a choice as to why they filmed it in black and white. Yeah. And with having to shoot nighttime sequences and other stuff, it probably was easier somewhat with some of the black and white.
And I think it was probably just budgetary, in my opinion. I mean, if they're running low on cash and they're using Roman candles for tracers, black and white film's going to be cheaper than color or Technicolor at that time, you know, so it's going to be cheaper. But I think it works, you know, because like you said, like we've all said, you know, it was a low budget flick, and then if you're going to do it in color, you're going to see things that you know, it's pretty obvious that it's in California, like I said, or things like that. Or, you know, I sincerely doubt that those bunkers that they were in were actually built from honest-to-God concrete.
They weren't. In fact, if you watch the sequence where Steve McQueen's standing up against one with the satchel charge, he actually steps away from it, and you see it flex off his back.
Awesome. So, and that's why they shot it in black and white. But I think that, like, the abrupt ending of the film, I think it does work. And I'll be honest with you, I hadn't, like you, Tommy, have you ever seen it before, Tanya?
Same as y'all, like when I was, I don't know,
a kid,
14.
Yeah, right. I hadn't seen this movie in a long time. And frankly, I forgot about it. I mean, I knew McQueen was in it. I knew Coburn was in it. And I remember that. I knew Bob Newhart was in it because I disliked his character. But
I like the Jeep, though. I did like what they did with that.
The backfire Jeep. Shade tree stuff there. But, you know, as far as the abrupt ending, when I was watching it on Monday night, I completely forgot about that, and it took me by surprise. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess we're done here. But it does work. Because, I mean, you know, 95% of the squad is now dead. You got Bobby Darin and Davy Crockett are the only two, you know, living members of the squad any longer. And like you said, Tanya, where do you go from here?
Yeah. So. And one point was made that it, you know, in the end, it's a war movie or a combat movie, but it really is an anti-war movie. And one way it is that, I think, is that in the end, there's no winners or there's no actual victory here in that particular instance, right? It's really just the flames and you know, people keep shooting at each other, as you know, easily put as that. And it's not, there is no actual resolution. There's no, and in the end, you know.
Much like combat on the Siegfried Line.
Yeah, really. It's very true. Very true, too. I got to wonder, thinking about it now, you know, Bob Newhart's character, who I disliked in this film, how much did he influence Corporal Upham in Saving Private Ryan, who was also a typist who was thrust into a unit of veteran soldiers?
I read where Tom Hanks and Spielberg actually used this film to pull things for Saving Private Ryan out of there. I think with some of the character development, especially with dealing with accents and foreign accents and other things in there like we see in Saving Private Ryan. And then some of the sequences even apparently with some of the combat were used either in the... If you actually look at how they're staged sometimes, early on in the combat, it actually looks sort of like the chaos on Omaha Beach in certain sections in the very beginning sequences. But... and then I think probably the same too is true on the bridge sequences as well. So I think there was some lending, if you will, of this movie to Saving Private Ryan.
I think it's undeniable between Bob Newhart and Upham. I think they're very, very, very similar.
I actually like Bob Newhart better.
Anyway, go listen to the Saving Private Ryan episode, which was in our first season of this here podcast. So anyway, let's get to it. And Tanya, I'll start with you. Did you like it, and would you recommend this film?
I liked it a whole lot more than I expected I would. Yeah. I was really impressed by the personal interactions and how I was shown how these guys just, made it work for themselves, how they managed to get up in the morning. As I just mentioned, it is an anti-war movie, and for that I like it. The anti-hero is just this. Let's put it like that. If you don't like war movies, if you don't like the anti-hero concept or are into these kinds of combat stories, then I wouldn't recommend it. If you are into, Steve McQueen, if you want to see something that really shows a very intense kind of couple of days where tensions run high and decisions are made that may not be the best, or maybe, then I would say yes, definitely. But it's not your easy, like, oh no, my favorite movie, definitely go watch it.
Tommy?
I agree with a lot of what you said, Tommy. I look at it like, this is something I'll probably watch every now and then. I won't wait another 15, 20, 30 years before I watch it again. But it's not something that I have to feel like I'll have to watch at least once a year. If you're, like you said, if you're a fan of Steve McQueen, you definitely should check it out. If you're a fan of Davy Crockett, you definitely should check it out. But, to me, I think, especially for it being a low-budget film, it's probably one of the best made low-budget films. It's not, there's some cheese to it here and there, sure, but it's not as bad as it could be, we'll put it that way. And, I like it way better than I like Pearl Harbor, which also had a loaded cast. And by the way, I enjoyed that podcast.
Well, thank you very much.
To me, they could have easily just thrown people like Steve McQueen, Fess Parker, and Bob Newhart into this, and it been a horrible movie. But they actually pulled it off, and especially, like we said, considering the low budget, especially low budget some of these folks were used to using in Hollywood films or shows, TV shows, whatever. I definitely think it's a great movie. If you have a family member who served in the Siegfried Line or in this area or in this unit, it's definitely worth watching to get a little bit better understanding and appreciation, and I would definitely recommend it to people.
Yep, agree with everything everybody said here. I like this movie. Like I said, I hadn't seen it in a very, very long time. I like the fact, too, that it's only like 86 minutes or something like that. It's short and sweet. It's to the point. It's boom, you're there, you're done, you're out. And it doesn't drag on, which is good.
Yeah, it's easy to watch.
Some World War II movies that we have covered here do tend to drag on, good or not.
Like Pearl Harbor.
Well, no, there's that. But this movie is very good. I would definitely recommend it. I think it's very accurate for its representation of the combat on the Siegfried Line, even though it is, as I said, short. There's good and bad points to that, but it's accurate. It's a cool movie. It's just cool. It's kind of a time capsule of the period, really, too, when it was made, which I think is neat, and it's good. It's definitely worth checking out and spending an hour and 20 some odd minutes checking it out. It's definitely worth it. Tommy, can you sum it up? Give me some final thoughts.
Good movie. Keep it simple. I don't know.
And he's out.
I agree with that. Summing it up, a good, fairly short movie that shows very intensely and in a very intense and accurate way how these bunch of guys had to hold a position with trickery, which I thought was an interesting part of the movie. And it ends in a catastrophe for them.
I'll sum it up by just saying I think it's an often forgotten, and I wouldn't say it's a classic on the lines of like The Great Escape or Battleground or even SPR. I wouldn't say it's a classic in that realm because it's not. But I would say that it is an oft-forgotten movie that definitely needs to be seen. It's one that I highly enjoyed watching, even though I hadn't seen it in a very, very long time. So check it out. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, speaking about the Siegfried Line, tune into our mini episode next week. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Mallory Kirk, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. Before I go, I just want to say a special thanks to Tessa Jager, our former producer, who is the one that got this program off the ground. She's leaving us for greener pastures, and we're going to miss her. And with that, I want to thank you again and just say this has been a production of the National World War II Museum.